The dust of 2 millennia coated David Shalev's hands as he brushed away debris from the limestone fragment. His headlamp cast harsh shadows across the carved Hebrew characters, each letter etched with deliberate precision into the ancient stone. The dig site beneath Jerusalem's old city had yielded many treasures over the past 6 months, but nothing like this. Mizmor Lasaf, he whispered, reading the opening words, a psalm of Asaph. His breath caught. The numbering that followed wasn't what he expected. Where modern Bibles place Psalm 83, this fragment bore different markings, older, more elaborate script that seemed to writhe in the dancing light. David's assistant, Sarah, peered over his shoulder. Another psalm fragment? Maybe. David's weathered fingers traced the carved letter.
At 42, he'd spent half his life in these tunnels and excavation sites. First as an IDF engineer clearing ordnance from ancient cisterns, then as an archaeologist drawn back to the stones that had shaped his people's destiny. But the text? It's different. The Hebrew was archaic, predating even the Masoretic texts by centuries. As he photographed each line, David felt an odd chill despite the underground chamber's stifling air. The psalm spoke of familiar enemies, Edom, Moab, the children of Ammon, but interwoven with these names were others that made no sense. Nephilim shadows bound to Tyre, firewalkers of Damascus, the smoke children of Babylon's ruins. Dr. Shalev? Sarah's voice carried concern. You've been staring at that thing for 20 minutes. David blinked, realizing his headlamp had begun to dim. How long had he been down here? The fragment seemed larger now, its surface covered in more text than he remembered. Impossible, of course. Stone didn't grow new writing. But there it was, additional verses carved in the same ancient script, speaking of confederacies, that transcended the merely political. When the psalm is spoken in the place of weeping, one line read, "The bound shall wake, and the watchers shall remember their covenant with the void." "We need to get this to the lab," David said, carefully wrapping the fragment in preservation cloth. Tonight. David's apartment in the German colony overlooked the valley where ancient kings had once sacrificed their children to Molech. Tonight, as he worked by lamplight translating the fragment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from those dark hills. The text was unlike anything in canonical scripture. Psalm 83 in modern Bibles was a prayer for deliverance from Israel's enemies, but this version contained verses that seemed to describe those enemies in supernatural terms. The Hagarites were called spawn of the desert wind, while the Ishmaelites bore the title Children of the Burning Covenant. Most disturbing were the additional stanzas that appeared nowhere in traditional texts. From Damascus shall rise the glass-born, their bodies like shattered windows, reflecting the fire that consumed their flesh. From the north shall come the smoke riders, whose horses are made of ash and bone. They shall encircle the holy mountain until the earth cracks and bleeds shadow. David rubbed his eyes. The words seemed to shift and dance on the ancient stone, forming new meanings even as he watched. He reached for his coffee cup and froze. The liquid had turned dark red, steam rising from its surface in spirals that looked almost like a knock at the door shattered his concentration. The coffee was normal again, dark brown and cooling. David shook his head and answered the door to find his neighbor, Mrs. Rosen, holding a plate of cookies. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, then paused. "David, are you feeling all right? You look pale." "Just tired," he managed. Behind her, through his doorway, he glimpsed his apartment wall. For just a moment, it seemed covered in maps, drawn in something dark and wet. Lines connecting Damascus to Jerusalem, Tehran to Gaza, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Mrs. Rosen followed his gaze. "Your wall needs repainting," she said matter-of-factly. "The moisture down here makes everything look stained." When she left, David examined the wall. Plain white paint, slightly yellowed with age, nothing more. He returned to his translation work, but the words on the fragment had changed again. New verses had appeared, written in a script so ancient it predated known Hebrew entirely. The watchers sleep in tombs of glass, in caverns deep beneath the mount. When prayer becomes their worship song, the seals shall break, the dead shall count the living as their rightful prey, and heaven's light shall turn to gray. David's hands trembled as he copied the text. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, police, ambulance, or fire, he couldn't tell. The sound seemed to harmonize with something else, a low humming that came from the stone fragment itself. He was still working when the first vision struck. The apartment dissolved around David like smoke. He stood instead on the ramparts of the old city, watching faceless soldiers march through the Jaffa Gate. Their uniforms bore no insignia, and where their faces should have been, only smooth skin stretched tight over skull shapes. When they moved, black sand poured from their sleeves and boot prints, forming trails that spelled out words in languages he didn't recognize. Above them flew a burning angel, its 6 wings dripping ash that fell like snow on the ancient stones. When it opened its mouth, David heard his own voice speaking the words from the fragment. Prophecy is worship. Worship us. The vision shattered as his phone rang. David gasped, finding himself slumped over his desk, the fragment glowing faintly in the lamplight. The caller was his colleague at Hebrew University, Professor Goldstein. "David, thank God you're awake. Turn on the news." David fumbled for his remote. The breaking news banner read, "Rockets strike northern Israel. Hezbollah claims responsibility." The reporter spoke of casualties in Haifa, of Syrian military movements, of Iranian warships in the Mediterranean. But David barely heard the words. Behind the reporter, in the background footage of smoke rising over the Galilee, he saw shapes that shouldn't exist, tall figures made of glass and fire, walking through the destruction like ancient gods surveying their domain. "David, are you there?" "I'm here." David's voice sounded distant to his own ears. "How many killed?" 17 confirmed, but that's not why I'm calling. We've received reports of similar artifacts surfacing across the region. Stone fragments bearing partial psalm texts, all predating known manuscripts. They're appearing in digs, from Damascus to Tehran, all containing references to the same confederacy you mentioned in your preliminary report. After hanging up, David returned to the fragment. The stone was warm to the touch now, almost feverish. New text had appeared overnight, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When the northern fire falls as rain, and mothers weep for children slain, the ancient compact shall be woken, and every seal shall be broken. From 7 nations comes the call, to see Jerusalem's temple fall. David's laptop chimed with incoming emails, security camera footage from the Wailing Wall, sent by a contact in the Antiquities Authority. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m., just 20 minutes ago. In the grainy video, he watched shadows moving independently of the tourists who cast them, pooling together near the ancient stones and forming shapes that looked almost like writing. Hebrew letters spelled out across the plaza in living darkness, forming and reforming the same phrase over and over. The psalm is spoken. The Confederacy rises. 3 days later, David woke to the sound of air raid sirens. The news was almost incomprehensible. Damascus had been struck by what Israeli officials claimed was a limited nuclear response to Syrian chemical weapons deployment. The Syrian government denied using chemical weapons. The Iranians accused Israel of unprovoked aggression. The Americans called for restraint. The Russians mobilized their Mediterranean fleet. But David knew the truth was far more terrible. He'd been translating the fragment's final verses when the flash lit up his apartment windows, a brilliant white light from the northeast that lasted nearly 30 seconds. In that light, he'd seen them clearly, the watchers rising from their tombs beneath Damascus, their bodies like molten glass, cracking and reforming with each step they took toward Jerusalem. The fragment now pulsed with inner light, its surface completely covered in text that wrote itself as he watched. The psalm was completing itself, each new verse manifesting in response to unfolding events. From the city of jasmine and blood, where Abraham's servant once stood, rise the glass-born from atomic fire, their hunger growing ever dire. 7 by 7 they march as one toward the city of David's son. David's phone buzzed with emergency alerts, radiation readings, evacuation zones, military mobilization. But underneath these mundane warnings, he sensed something else, a collective holding of breath, as if the earth itself waited for what came next. He turned on the television to find chaos. Satellite imagery showed Damascus as a crater of green glass, still glowing hours after the explosion. But within that glass, dark shapes moved. The newsreaders called them debris patterns and heat distortions, but David saw them for what they were. 49 figures, 7 from each of the 7 ancient enemies listed in the psalm, all walking steadily south toward Israel. Dr. Sarah called him, her voice tight with fear. "David, you need to see this. We found more fragments today, in sites that were sealed yesterday. They're appearing overnight, all bearing the same text as yours. And David, they're warm. They're all warm. Where? Everywhere. Babylon, Persepolis, Alexandria, every ancient site mentioned in the Confederacy verses. David, what is that fragment you found?" Before he could answer, his apartment door burst open. 4 men in dark suits entered without invitation, their faces bearing the flat expressions of shin-bed operatives. The leader, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, introduced himself as Agent Corin. "Dr. Shalev, you're coming with us. Bring the fragment." "On whose authority?" "The Prime Minister's. You've been translating what our people believe is either a terrorist code or—" Corin paused, choosing his words carefully, "or something that requires immediate containment." As they escorted him from his apartment, David glimpsed his reflection in the hallway mirror. For just a moment, his face wasn't his own. It was smooth and featureless, like the soldiers in his vision. When he blinked, his reflection was normal again. But the fragment in his bag continued to pulse with its own inner light. The secure facility beneath the Knesset buzzed with barely controlled panic. David sat in a windowless room, the fragment on the table before him, surrounded by linguists, theologians, military analysts, and intelligence officers who spoke in hushed tones about operational security and existential threats. "Explain it again," demanded General Raz, the IDF's chief of intelligence. "These verses predict current events?" "They don't predict them," David said, his voice hoarse from hours of interrogation. "They're causing them. The psalm isn't prophecy, it's invocation. Each verse that manifests brings us closer to—" He gestured helplessly at the fragment, "to whatever they're designed to summon." On the room's screens, satellite feeds showed the impossible. The glass-born entities from Damascus had reached the Golan Heights. They moved in perfect formation, 7 lines of 7 figures each, leaving trails of melted stone in their wake. Israeli tank units had engaged them twice. Both times, the shells had passed harmlessly through the creatures' bodies, while the tanks themselves had spontaneously begun melting, their steel flowing like water. Rabbi Goldenberg, brought in as a theological consultant, leaned forward. "You're suggesting that this fragment contains actual supernatural power? That reciting these verses can bring beings from the spiritual realm into physical reality?" "Look at the screens," David replied. "What would you call those things walking toward Jerusalem?" The rabbi fell silent. On the monitors, the entities had stopped at the pre-1967 border, arranged in perfect rows facing south. They stood motionless, waiting, as if for some signal. Agent Corin burst into the room. "We've lost contact with our teams in Lebanon and Jordan. Last transmission showed similar entities manifesting at archaeological sites in both countries. The Americans are reporting the same thing in Iraq. 49 figures of glass and ash, all moving toward Israel." "How many altogether?" asked General Raz. 343. 7 nations, 7 times 7 entities each. Corin's face was pale, just like your fragment describes, Dr. Shalev. David studied the Psalm's final verses, which had continued writing themselves throughout the day. "When 7 times 7 times 7 stand upon the borders of the promised land, let him who holds the written word decide if angels shall be heard, or if the Watcher's ancient claim shall cleanse the world in holy flame." "It's offering me a choice," David whispered. "What choice?" The Prime Minister had entered the room without fanfare, his security detail forming a protective circle. David had seen him on television countless times, but never noticed how old he looked, how the weight of leadership had carved lines of exhaustion across his features. "The psalm can be completed or destroyed. If I speak the final verses, the Watchers will fully manifest. They'll fulfill their covenant, the complete annihilation of Israel's enemies, but also—" David's hands shook as he traced the ancient letters. "Also the end of free will. The text speaks of a kingdom where worship becomes compulsory, where prayer itself transforms into chains of servitude. And if you destroy it, the entities remain as they are, powerful but incomplete, bound by the physical laws that currently limit them. The wars continue as they have for thousands of years. People die, but humanity remains human." Outside, air raid sirens began wailing again. On the screens, the glass entities had begun moving once more, converging on Jerusalem from all directions. The city's ancient walls seemed to glow in response to their approach. The Prime Minister studied David's face. "What do you recommend, Dr. Shalev?" David looked at the fragment one last time. The stone had grown warm enough to feel uncomfortable in his hands, and the carved letters now pulsed with rhythm of a vast, inhuman heartbeat. In its surface, he could see reflected not his own face, but that of the burning angel from his visions, its mouth moving in silent invitation. "I know what I have to do," he said. The rooftop of the Knesset building offered a panoramic view of Jerusalem under siege. The glass entities had reached the city's outskirts, forming concentric circles around the ancient walls. Where they walked, the modern world seemed to fade. Streetlights flickered and died, cars stalled in their tracks, and electronic devices sparked and went silent. David stood alone at the roof's center, the fragment heavy in his hands. Below him, the city held its breath. Above him, storm clouds gathered despite the clear evening forecast, and within those clouds, shapes moved that belonged to no earthly sky. "Elohei Yisrael," he whispered, "God of Israel," then stopped. The words felt wrong in his mouth, as if something else was trying to speak through him. The fragment's final verse had completed itself moments ago, appearing in letters that seemed to burn themselves into the stone. Speak now the words of binding deep, and wake the watchers from their sleep, or cast the stone into the fire, and let mortal flesh expire in wars that rage from age to age, while freedom burns on history's page. Through his earpiece he heard the voices of the command center below, casualty reports from the entity's approach, international tensions escalating toward global war, the sound of F-16s scrambling to engage targets that conventional weapons couldn't touch. David. The voice came from behind him, but when he turned, no one was there. Instead, he saw the burning angel from his visions, its wings spread wide against the stormy sky. Up close, he could see that its feathers were made of pages, millions of pages from holy books, all burning but never consumed. You know what you must do. Do I? David's voice cracked. If I speak the words, Israel's enemies die, but so does human freedom. If I don't, if you don't, the wars continue, your people suffer. Children die in rocket attacks and suicide bombings. The cycle repeats until time itself ends. The angel's voice was his own voice, speaking words he'd never thought. Is preserving the illusion of free will worth eternal suffering? David looked down at Jerusalem's ancient walls, where Abraham had once prepared to sacrifice Isaac, where Solomon had built his temple, where Christ had carried his cross, where Muhammad had ascended to heaven. Sacred ground, soaked in the blood of prophets and martyrs, all of whom had faced impossible choices between divine will and human conscience. The fragment pulsed in his hands, growing hot enough to burn. Around the city, the glass entities had begun to sing, a harmonic resonance that made the earth tremble and the heavens weep. In response, the burning pages that formed the angel's wings began to write new words, filling the air with floating text that spelled out the final invocation, "Come forth, ye bound to ancient vow, the time of choosing is here now. Let flesh be glass and glass be fire, and grant thy servants their desire to see the world made clean and pure, where worship chains forever endure." David felt the words trying to force themselves from his lips. The fragment in his hands grew white-hot, and his skin began to blister where it touched the stone. Around him, the air itself seemed to thicken, as if reality was holding its breath. But in that moment of ultimate choice, he thought of Mrs. Rosen bringing him cookies, of Sarah's concern for his well-being, of children playing in Jerusalem's parks, of lovers walking hand in hand through the old city's narrow streets, imperfect, mortal, free. "No," he whispered. The word came out as a shout that echoed across the rooftops. "No!" David raised the fragment above his head and brought it down against the concrete roof with all his strength. The ancient stone shattered like glass, sending fragments skittering across the rooftop. Where each piece landed, small fires bloomed and quickly died. The effect was immediate. Around Jerusalem's perimeter, the glass entities stopped their singing and began to crack. One by one they collapsed into piles of cooling sand. The burning angel let out a shriek that shattered windows for miles around, then dissolved into ash that the wind scattered toward the four corners of the earth. The storm clouds above began to disperse, revealing stars that seemed unusually bright in the clearing sky. David fell to his knees, his hands burned but free. In the distance he could hear the sounds of a city returning to life, car engines starting, phones ringing, the ordinary chaos of human existence resuming its eternal dance. But even as the immediate supernatural threat ended, his earpiece crackled with updates: Iranian missiles launching from the north, Egyptian tanks massing in Sinai, Syrian artillery preparing to fire. The human wars would continue, as they always had, as perhaps they always would. David smiled grimly and whispered a prayer, not to the burning angel, but to whatever force in the universe still believed in the terrible, beautiful burden of human choice. 6 months later, David Shalev sat in a small cafe in Tel Aviv, watching tourists photograph the ancient port of Jaffa. His hands, scarred from that night on the Knesset rooftop, held a simple cup of coffee that stayed the right color no matter how long he stared at it. The wars had continued, as he'd known they would. Damascus had been rebuilt with international aid, its green glass crater now a memorial park where children played among fountains designed by architects who'd never heard of watchers or confederacies. The various militias and armies had returned to their conventional conflicts, terrible but purely human in their scope and motivation. David no longer worked as an archaeologist. The official story was that he'd suffered a nervous breakdown during the brief crisis period that historians were already calling the Glass Week. He'd been quietly pensioned off, his dig site sealed, his research files classified indefinitely. But sometimes, late at night, He still received calls from colleagues reporting strange discoveries, stone fragments that seemed to write themselves, ancient texts that changed depending on who read them, psalms that didn't match any known manuscripts. David listened politely to these reports, offered his professional opinion, and then forgot about them as quickly as possible. He'd learned that some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, some mysteries too costly to solve. The psalm fragment had taught him that human free will, for all its flaws and tragedies, was worth preserving, even at the cost of continued suffering. Better to struggle with genuine choice than to surrender to the certainty of divine compulsion, even if that compulsion promised peace. As the sun set over the Mediterranean, David finished his coffee and prepared to return to his small apartment. He taught Hebrew to university students now, helping them read the ancient text with appropriate respect and caution. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was his own choice, and that made all the difference. Behind him, unnoticed by the tourists or cafe staff, words had begun writing themselves in the steam on his window. The watchers remember. The psalm endures, the choice remains. David saw the reflection but didn't turn around. Some messages, he'd learned, were better left unread. He walked away into the gathering darkness, free in his ignorance, human in his limitations, carrying his scars like badges of honor in a war that would never truly end. The window's steam faded, taking its cryptic message with it. But somewhere in the world, in archaeological sites still undiscovered, other fragments waited in patient silence for the next scribe brave enough, or foolish enough, to decipher their terrible truths. The choice, as always, would be theirs to make.